Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh, high school teacher in Los Angeles, trying to bring viewpoint diversity to important topics in society. The topic for today is going to be on manhood and masculinity. And about 2 or 3 years ago, I did back-to-back episodes with two very different perspectives on this of Ryan Mickler from Order of Man, I believe it is, and Stefanos Sifandos. About like emotional connectiveness and stuff like that. But since then, the crisis has gotten worse. And we're going to dive into that with my guest today, who is a former Army Ranger who founded the podcast and program Art of Masculinity. And I'm really excited to have him here because I think he can bring a lot of perspective to this topic, and we can dive into what he's done and what he does, and hopefully it can help some of the young men out there, like the population I teach, and even guys who are my age, in their 40s and 50s and stuff, who are kind of struggling with the modern iteration of what it means to be a man. And Johnny Elsasser, thank you so much for being here, man. I really appreciate you taking your time out. Time is a valuable asset. It's a valuable resource for us, and you giving yours to me, and then my platform. I really appreciate it, man. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely, brother. I really appreciate you reaching out and inviting me on the show. I know you have a high level of intellect, so I feel like this is going to be a very fun conversation. And I'm really just excited to dive into this subject, not only for like this younger generation, but also for us as well, being in the older generation, what it kind of looks like to evolve as men today.
Yeah. So can you give us a little bit of your background first? Because one of the reasons that I reached out to you specifically for this, when I wanted to touch back in, I was like, you have like the credentials, like your resume for masculinity, like how to be a man, like that kind of stuff. And we'll dive into this. Like even that kind of stuff sounds so corny to say, like if you're signing up for Hustlers University with Andrew Tate and like you're taking a class on how to be an alpha, you're not an alpha, like something like that. So I get it. But what is your background? What kind of brought you down this pathway? Like even like from a young man, up until to where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question to always start this way, because there's a lot of philosophies that kind of are the underlying premises for how we develop masculinity in general from a sociological standpoint that we can dive into later, that most men's coaches don't even get into because they haven't done the research, to be honest. And it's not to call them out, it's just to say that it's not something that they're diving into. So for me, I was fortunate enough that I was connected to my godfather, who's my uncle. He was very much kind of like a guy's guy, but he had that level of humbleness and kind of quirkiness and sense of humor that you wouldn't necessarily expect from a tough guy. So like he kind of raised a lot of us boys, because there was like 7 of my other cousins that were boys, and we were all freaking just growing up being like your little savages, man, just running around, climbing trees, playing sports, fighting each other all the time. So it's really funny. But he taught us he tried to teach us how to be good men growing up. So that's kind of where it started for me. And if we fast forward, I was 17 years old, exiting high school, didn't know what I was going to do, stumbled into an Army recruiting office, had no clue what the heck that even meant, and ended up signing up for the military and going into special operations, which was U.S. Army Rangers. And from there, being so young, there was still a lot that was going to be imprinted on the man that I was going to grow into. And so I got to develop a lot of great qualities from really tough men who didn't give themselves a lot of ability for failure, but also understood how to be adaptable in the situations we were going in, which that kind of leads to being adaptable as a man today too. But in that also, I was ingrained and indoctrinated with this high level of alpha male, right? And to some detriment, when you leave that environment and you go to quote unquote the real world, that was where I struggled, right? So I did special operations, had 4 combat tours between Iraq and Afghanistan. Then I actually went to a private company for 5 years called Triple Canopy, and I protected the U.S. ambassador out of Baghdad for 5 years. So I was in the Middle East, in and out of the Middle East, for about a decade of my life, starting from about 18 to 28. And again, that paramilitary group, a lot of alpha males, a lot of dudes really kind of ingrained in that old way of being a man and not looking at the evolutionary pieces. And neither was I. I was stuck in that as well. So I can't say I had evolved whatsoever from that point. But when I came home, I ended up going down. I lost myself. I lost I really lost the man that I was, because in those moments when I was in protection and when I was in special operations, I had a purpose, and the purpose was kind of defined for me. It was this flag, and it was protecting, the politicians who were going overseas, trying to create better relationships for the countries that we were in, right? And especially in the Middle East at the time. So there was a bigger purpose than myself, and that really defined my role as a man in life. And when I came home and that was gone, it was like, whoa, I got to write my own purpose. What does that even look like? Like, who is this guy? So I started to, I held a lot of judgment for other people, which was negative to me building great relationships with men like yourself. I would immediately judge people because I'd be like, oh, you're not from an alpha environment. You're not from Spec Ops, bro. Who are you? Like, so that negativity deteriorated a lot of potential relationships and friendships that I could have had. And then also with women, it was like I was this uber alpha masculine, and it was like, okay, like where's the balance though for the emotional connection and the emotional intelligence? I didn't have necessarily coming back out of that. So that ended up in a failed marriage. I got divorced. I was drinking too much. I just was not in a positive mindset to have a open communication where we could develop as a couple. And so from there, we ended up divorcing. And that's when I met my current wife now. She and I were friends for a while. And she was like, hey, throws this book at me, like, you got to read this. And I was like, I am not going to read a self-development book. First, I thought self-development was like, it was a weakness. I was like, oh, if you need somebody else to help you to be the man that you need to be, like, you're a failure. Like, you suck. That was literally my mindset. And then I also was like, oh, I'm not going to listen to another man just talk to me and tell me like how I can better myself. I can figure this out. Well, lo and behold, I gave it about a couple months, picked the book up, and I started to read it, and it was a punch in the stomach. And the book was Excuses Be Gone by Dr. Wayne Dyer. And he just writes so beautifully because he writes directly at you. He doesn't care, and he's highly educated, but he doesn't write like over your head. So it was a really great book for me. It punched me in the stomach, told me to be accountable for all the excuses that I was making, even the ones I believed were justified, all the excuses I was making. And then that started me on my path of doing my own inner work. And then from there, the podcast came out because, just like you said, with my background, it gives me enough credibility for guys to give me 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And if I could get a platform where they would give me 5 minutes and I could maybe give them a tool or a perspective that could help them just change a little bit and evolve, that was what I was here for. So that was how the podcast came to be. And then since that, it's been really trying to help guys.
Wow. Yeah. Johnny, talking to you, it's a weird thing because the Army Rangers, for people who don't know, Army Rangers, it's like the top, like, it's like, those are like, you guys are like the top operators, the most badass guys that are walking the planet. I mean, to go from that, I understand how you are in that environment and you go, I'm not picking up the book. And I understand how you start drinking and you start saying like, guys that are civilians or whatever they are, are soy boys or whatever it is. Like, I get it. I feel like that. I have friends that are, from like teams and stuff like that. And like, I feel like that around them. That's why I like jujitsu so much. Is like, maybe I have a shot on the mat of like matching you somewhere. But now hearing you talk though, is you talk like, I don't know. It's, let me get to, what made you pick up the book? Why did you, I get why you didn't pick up the book. What made you decide to pick up the book? Because for a lot of men, I think this, and you know this better than I do, but the suicide rate, the PTSD, the depression rate for soldiers is so high. Some of that has got to be related to the unwillingness to pick up the book, which is essentially saying, I need some help in some way, because you've been conditioned to just be such a tough, badass guy that you can handle things on your own. And even for kids and young people who didn't go through what you did, that training, there still is that itch of like, a man doesn't go to therapy. A man doesn't talk about his feelings. There is some element of that. What made you pick up the book?
Dude, it was literally the fact that I was like, no, as I was getting out of that, or as that marriage ended and I was on my own in my own apartment, one, I was isolated. So I was on the other side of the country from where my family and my closest friends were. A lot of my buddies were still working overseas. So I was very isolated in that. And I didn't have like any friends in that area except obligatory friends, which were the ones that were from work, which typically a lot of those people may not align with you in your authenticity, but they're kind of like forced to be in your life, right?
Yeah.
So that's all I had. So I was isolated. But then on top of that, what made me pick it up was like, dude, you just had a failed marriage. You're not doing anything different right now. So why don't you try doing something different that you wouldn't normally do and see what happens because of it? And in that, I started to gain clarity on the things I needed to challenge in myself. And when I realized that, I was like, oh, I'm all in, dude. Because strong men, and this is where a real alpha comes into play. And I'm not saying that like, oh, I'm a real alpha. I'm saying real alpha men are not scared to challenge themselves and their perceptions and their shadows. And that is where I was like, okay, if I'm going to be a strong man in this, normal world, the environment outside of like hostility and military, if I'm going to be a man, a good man in this world, I got to be willing to look at myself. And I realized, I was like, that's a weakness, not wanting to explore that conversation internally. And so for me, I was like, well, I got to eradicate weaknesses. That's what I did in the military. So I was like, if that's a weakness, then I got to challenge this. And that's what I need to dive into. And that's why I picked up the book, because I was like, wow, I'm really blocking a lot of my own development and the life that I could actually have of joy and fun and happiness and open perspectives and open conversations and intellect. Man, intellect is such a big thing. And for me, I was cutting that off as well. So I was like, no, I'm done with this. I'm going to try something, one thing, just one little thing different. And that was picking up that book and reading it.
Yeah. Ego, right?
A lot of it is the ego. Yeah. It's protecting us from our insecurities.
Yeah.
And the ego can serve us only when we learn to harness it. But majority of the time, we're unaware and unconscious around the ego. And it's a detriment to our lives. It's a protection system so that we don't feel inferior. And for us men, it's so we don't feel emasculated, because then we feel like we can be taken advantage of.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, so you basically use the same kind of attack badass mentality of, wait a second, you became aware of like, oh, it's almost like guys who are like that. It's like, oh, you're actually scared to go to therapy. You're actually scared to talk about soft things and stuff like that. And when you flip it around like that, then you're like, oh, okay, I'm going back into attack mode. That's
exactly.
That makes sense.
Exactly. And that was a strength. That was a huge strength of mine. As you know, you got friends who were in Ranger Battalion. That was a huge strength of ours, was to say, hey, there's a weakness. And I've always been that way, even as a kid. Like, I played soccer for 20 years, and growing up, like, they asked me, they were like, hey, could you play left fullback? And I was like, sure, I'll give it a shot. So I literally would just practice on using my left foot all the time. I did isolated drills for my left foot, and eventually I could use my left just as good as my right. And I'm a right foot player, but I could use my left just as well. And that was the thing. I was like, okay, I got to go after weaknesses. I've done it my whole life. I did it in soccer. I did it in the military. If I see this as a weakness, I'm going to switch that mindset, and I'm going to say, okay, now it's time to challenge you. And that's where that exploration ended up taking place.
Yeah. I love that. I like that idea. Well, talk about youth sports. I mean, we're in a crisis right now. I think Richard Rees wrote a book, what's it called? Like, of boys and men. Jordan Peterson's talked about incels and stuff like that. Like, there's a real crisis for, young men and men today. Part of this is because we have traditionally, since caveman days, been protectors and providers, but the world is safer now in a lot of ways. We don't have saber-tooth tigers coming into our cave, and women are actually out earning a lot of their male counterparts. Colleges are more filled with women and stuff like that. So when it comes to providing, my wife makes more money than I do. So this could be part of what leads to a lot of men saying like, well, then what is it? If I don't need to actually protect my, like, I have friends that don't have firearms, don't know martial arts or whatever, and they're just like, we'll be safe. And they're probably right. I don't recommend that, but they're probably right. So if you're gonna be safe, you don't need to protect your family in the traditional ways, and you don't need to provide because your wife makes good money or whatever it is, then what is my place? Does that seem like it aligns with what you've seen? Because it's so deep in this world now. Do you think that that's part of the crisis that's going on, or what do you attribute this kind of crisis that people are turning to Liver King or Andrew Tate or whatever it is? Just anyone who says, here's a good way to be a man, do this. Like, people turn to these images. Like, what do you think is driving that? Because it's driving people to the important stuff that you're doing as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, and what I look at when I take an overview of this and I see who's got like some of these bigger communities, especially with men, I look at the messaging that's going on. And from my personal perspective, so this is just, my perspective, is that when I take into account the actual sociological studies, which we looked at, we talked about just a little earlier, just touched on, when I look at what has been done and how they've evaluated masculinity and the evolution of masculinity in civilization, right? Hunter-gatherer days are very different from where we've even come through when we've created cities, even the Romans, and you look at the Renaissance era. When you start to go through this, masculinity has always changed. It's never just been a provider and protector thing. So I look at some of these guys that are gaining traction right now, and I look at their message, and I think that they do present some good values for men, but I also look at them and say, okay, but a lot of what you're doing is taking men back to what they know, what they've been taught, what they've heard, right? From quote unquote tough men here. And they're giving a form of masculinity that's outdated, and it's not evolutionary. It's not taking us in a direction that says, hey, listen, the environment's changed. That doesn't necessarily apply nowadays. And so what happens, you know this, what happens when we see something we already know? Well, we become very open to it because we're comfortable. It's the term for that is groupthink, right? When we see a group of people that say the same things we do, we say, okay, I'm going to go hang out with this group because there's no contention there. I don't have to look at anything there. I don't have to challenge myself there. So if I have a group of men's coaches and men's influencers who are saying, dude, Will, here's the prescription for being a man. And you're like, oh, cool. That's kind of what I've already been told. So I know that I can resonate with that in the sense that I understand it. I'm going to go follow you. The thing that men aren't questioning when they do that is it actually authentic with you? And that's where the struggle for me when I hear this comes, because a lot of the guys I talk to, they're like, bro, that prescription that we got when we were like 10 years old, or that was passed on from our great grandfathers, that prescription doesn't necessarily fit with me. I never felt like I needed to learn how to use a gun because I just never felt like I was that unsafe. So it wasn't a priority, but I did learn how to be very intelligent and have intellectual conversations. And to me, that's a better version of a man, but I'm told that that's weak. So we're not questioning the authenticity behind any of this. And what I see is those guys that are kind of latching on to these dudes are saying, hey, man, let's keep you in a mindset that you're already familiar with. So feel comfortable in this community. And then you don't have to really challenge yourself. You don't have to challenge the shadows. You don't have to challenge any of the behaviors or comments that come along with these outdated versions. And you can have perspectives that you're already just familiar with. And to me, that is not the growth of masculinity. That's the stagnation of masculinity. That's where we end up getting held even back in the deterioration of masculinity, because it's not that outdated version, as you can see now, doesn't even really translate well nor survive very well. Now, do I believe in being a protector? Do I believe into knowing how to handle yourself if a situation comes up? Of course I do. It's a big part of my version of masculinity. But am I going to say, Will, you need to have that version of masculinity or else you're not a man? No, because at the end of the day, that doesn't necessarily translate even generationally. Look back to the summer of love era, late 60s and 70s. Those men were very different from the World War II era or the Korean War era or the all of that. They're very different from those. And they would have not been called men in those generations, but in their generation, they were men and they were looked at favorably.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. Like, because I think we automatically, and I do too, go into like, well, get in the gym, know how to start a fire and chop wood and stuff like that. But for these, computer nerd programmer kids who are, just not interested, they don't have, maybe their body is, sickly or something like that. Well, what about them? It's like, well, Elon Musk, like we admire him in a lot of ways as being like a man.
Right.
And if you see with his shirt off, it's not very impressive. It doesn't matter. That's a really good point. It's an important nuance, I think, is like a man of the 21st century.
Yeah, no. And you look at Russell Brand right now, he actually does do jujitsu, right? But you look at Russell Brand again, takes off his shirt. Could he go start a fire? probably not in the woods, like probably couldn't survive for a week on his own with no food, no water, having to do that. Like, who knows? He probably couldn't do that, but we respect him a lot because he is very much in his own authenticity. He owns the fact that he was an addict. He owns the behavior he had when he was an addict. He owns the sexuality that he had. I mean, he owns a lot of these things that are emasculated and told are feminine, yet we look at him as a respectable man in the world today. So it's like, we have to come to that conversation of, okay, like, what are we really saying is a man? Because what we're talking about when we talk about the underlying influence of masculinity, they've never been cross-generationally. And I did a reel on this, and it got a lot of feedback, both positive and negative, because people felt challenged in their masculinity. But masculinity has not been cross-generationally. It's not even cross-culturally around the world, and it's not even cross-regionally within the United States. It's not the same. The underlying factors that we determine as masculinity are very subjective. And if you look at the definition of masculinity in and of itself, it's arbitrary. And I firmly started to believe it's arbitrary because the fact that we had to allow room for evolution, because we noticed there wasn't a standard that was going to last generations, and there wasn't a standard that was going to last even cross culturally from country to country and, region to region. So I think somebody noticed that potentially, and they're like, cool, we'll give it a little bit of an arbitrary nature so that you could evolve it.
Yeah, that's I'm trying to think, like, what is a common thing that, Jocko, Russell Brand, Mr. Rogers, Elon Musk have in common? Would it be elements of like courage? Like, courage can have different forms. It's like doing what you know to be right, despite perhaps having fear, maybe humility, confidence. Like, what would you say are like the overlap that are like the descriptors for someone who is a 21st century and very diverse, but very 21st century man, kind of doing the proper masculine man thing? You know what I'm trying to get at? Kind of sloppy.
Yeah. No, this is great. This is great because I have an answer for it. And so success. But what I see, and this may sound broad, but it's not attributed to masculinity. What the commonality is with them is authenticity. They authentically are themselves, regardless of the room they're in, the conversation they're in, the environment they're in. Like, it doesn't matter. They're authentically who they are. And when you do that already promotes confidence, and you're looked at as a strong man. It's the authenticity because they don't necessarily have a common underlying thread other than the fact that they own exactly who they are when they're anywhere that they go and they're in any conversation. For me, that's what I see across men. This is why we look at guys like Elon Musk and Russell Brand and Joe Rogan and Jocko and all these guys. And we're like, bro, these dudes are men. And it's like, yeah, because they stand in their authenticity. Yeah. That's why.
Yeah, like they are who they are. They're aligned. I like that concept. Like, what you say, think, and do is all the same. Like, then they're honest, stuff like that. When you say confidence, part of that is like owning it. It's like sometimes my wife buys a lot of my clothes, and sometimes she buys these like shirts that I would like, they're sparklers. I like shiny or something. I'm like, oh my gosh. All right, fine. She's like, just own it. So just own it. It's like, if you walk out with confidence and you like actually just don't even think about it. It's when you get in your own head that it might look weird or something like that. Like that idea of just like owning it is a part of confidence. Is like, it is what it is. And if you fall down or you make a fool of yourself, you'll be fine. It's not it's not like
exactly
the concept that you're not going to fall down. It's like, if you fall down, you'll be okay. But let me ask you, when you say like authenticity, there are going to be young men who listen to this, who go, great, but I don't know who I am. So how do you suggest that people who, and sometimes they're older, they're not young men, and they just go, how can I be my authentic self when I don't have self-awareness? I don't know who I am, what I like, what I'm doing. They've just been living on autopilot, and they kind of have like an awakening moment. So what would you say to those men?
So I have a process for this, and I've worked with guys from their young 20s all the way up into their early 50s, and we've redefined the version of masculinity that's authentic to them. And there is a process to this. And the first thing I would say is it's not that you don't know, it's that you've never actually looked at it. You've never actually sat down and said, how do I assess this? And the first thing you have to do is assess what was given to you, not written by you, right? Because when we look at the perspective of how the brain works, from ages 2 to 8, we're in theta. And in that theta brainwave, this is where hypnosis works really well. We're completely a sponge and malleable. We're developing a lot of the premises of masculinity based on numerous different theories written out by Raywin Connell. But when we look at that, we're writing out those versions of masculinity by the relation to the men in our lives, to us, and then how we view them in respect to forms of leadership or mentorship or anything. So in 2 to 8, we're getting a lot of stuff written for us subconsciously that then affects us later down the road. Now, as we're adolescents, as we're getting into that teenage years and the early 20s, we're still having those influences, but we have more of a conscious attunement to gaining those influences, right? The 2 to 8 is totally subconscious. You don't have the ability to say that's valid, that's not valid, I like that, I don't like that. As we get older, we have that conscious awareness. So the first thing we have to do is write out some of the things that were given to us. The first way to do that is look who potentially you looked up to as a kid. It potentially might not be your father, by the way, and it could be a female. So looking up as to, hey, who were influences in my life? Who was around me when I was younger? And then who was around me that I looked up to as I got into those teenage years, early 20 years? And then start to address the traits of masculinity that you see in them. So we have to really understand where we came from to understand where we want to go. So we break down, okay, what are the traits that were there? What do I see in that person now? Or what do I remember from that person if they're not alive still? And write those down. Actually just take inventory of it. And then from that, you can start to dissect, okay, what of these do I not really believe makes a man? Like if I were to say, if Will and I were having a beer and I were to subconsciously and also consciously, just internally, I'm going to always judge you. I'm always going to be evaluating you against what it is to be a man because of my perspective. If I were sitting next to you, what were the qualities I would look at in you to say like, oh, that's a dude right there. That's a good dude, right? Those are the qualities you believe make a good man, which is what you want to hold yourself to. So you go off and you start crossing off the list, the things that do not resonate with you, that just, you're like, I don't necessarily think that makes a good guy. And I don't necessarily believe I need to do that. And sometimes that might be, hey man, maybe I don't need to be a protector because I just really don't feel like the world is that unsafe, whatever it is. Right. So like you do that and you start to cross those off. Then the next column that you can make is write out the features of men that you look up to in the present moment and write those traits out that you like that you may not possess. But like, for instance, intellect, like somebody may be talking to you and they're like, God, man, Will is just, he's got a high level of vocabulary. He's intelligent. He does, he takes care of himself in the gym. I really like those things. He takes care of his health. I really like those things. I may not have all that right now, but I like those. I'm going to include those in this second column. I'm going to start writing out those traits that I really like that maybe weren't in the past, but that I see now in men and it could be guys like even Joe Rogan, if you listen to his podcast, some of the things that he does, right, or says in the way that he behaves as a man. Maybe it is Russell Brand. Maybe it is Jocko. Maybe it is David Goggins, right? Like maybe it is that. It doesn't matter. But write down those features and put those in that second column. And then in that third column, that last column, I want guys to really combine what was left over from the first and then what they wrote out in the second. And this gives us a comprehensive list of what we believe a man should be based on our conscious awareness now today. So the subconscious is no longer writing this anymore. The subconscious is no longer the underlying theme. So we understand we have inventory. We've categorized what we believe makes a man. The last step to this is to whittle this list down to 3 traits. Okay. 3 traits. And the reason why I do this with men is because I know what it's like to be in a sympathetic nervous state, right? In the sympathetic nervous state, for everybody who's listening, especially for our younger listeners, it's like, in real life, it could be an argument with your spouse or your partner. It could be an argument with your friend, whatever drives an emotional response that basically supersedes any type of cognitive adjustment to how you handle the situation, right? So when you're in that sympathetic nervous state, you go to that fight or flight mentality. You're having all the physiological effects of that, and then you're responding pretty much unconsciously. When you get to that sympathetic nervous state, when I was in the military and I was doing all my combat tours and stuff, if you understand the foundation so well that in the sympathetic nervous state, you resort back to that foundation, you're going to respond as the man that you desire to be. So when you take those 3 traits, it's very easy to hardwire 3 traits in our brain. And what I say is whittle it down to 3. As you get more comfortable with this and you start to respond better to situations, in light of being that man you actually have chosen to be, you can expand this to like 5 and 7, whatever. But we start with 3 to get a really strong foundation. And when you have those 3, write them down on sticky notes, put them in front of you at your computer, put them in your bag, whatever. Look at them every day, put them on your mirror, look at them every day, and get those really ingrained in your mind. The 3 traits you firmly believe make a strong, good, well-rounded, positive man in this world, and hardwire that in. And that's where you get the opportunity to start really understanding who it is you are and how you want to present yourself as a man today. I know it's a long process, but
no, I love it. No, that answers my question though. I mean, be intentional. It's weird because like heterosexual men are drawn to other men in certain ways for certain reasons. Like the way he handled that situation is cool, or the way he was able to fix that problem in the house is cool. The way that he was able to create that cool thing on the computer and fix our computer, even if you're a computer nerd, is cool. So like we are drawn to that, and just like instead of just going like, oh, he's cool, really digging into like what are those specific traits, and then narrowing those down and looking for the meta of like what does a Jocko and a Fred, Mr. Rogers have in common, because they have certain things in common. Like discipline would be one. Mr. Rogers is always in the pool at like 5 a.m. or something like that and was on a schedule, and Jocko's discipline equals freedom. So okay, so discipline is something that like maybe for me I really admire, so that's going to be one of my 3. That's a really cool process that you kind of broke down there for us,
because it allows flexibility too, because there are men who if we truly understand the range of masculinity, it is very wide. And there are men who lean towards more maybe the creative or artistic side. And if you're in this firm belief that there's only one way to be a man, or that the old ways of like the World War II era was the only way to be a man, that guy is never going to have a place in the masculine environment, and he's always going to have some form of inferiority or emasculation done to him, whether it's internally or externally, because of the fact that we're ignorant to the wide range of what masculinity can look like. And so I wanted to, when I came up with this process, I wanted men to be able to explore that range, and then also to know that that authenticity as the man they desire to be is what's important. That's what sets aside the guys that we're talking about in mainstream media. But if you go off something that is outdated, that is fixed, that doesn't translate to the environment we are currently in within society, you're going to fall short. You're going to have sadness, you're going to have depression, you're going to feel emasculated, and that's going to lead to a lot of other toxic things within your life.
Yeah. A society that has men that are going through the crises like we have are not good. The class that I kind of dumped the most energy into is my civics class. And a lot of the way I try and frame that is like, how are we going to build a better society for the future? And what would you suggest as far as like how we, whether it's at a community level, from a government level, can kind of set the system up or set each other up in a way that can try to do these things that you promote, whatever it is, because we want strong men. And again, strong is not just physically strong. Strong is a lot of things. It's courageous men. It's men who are going to do the whatever it is to take care of the orphans and the widows, or whatever way you want to kind of frame it. But our society is not really embracing that. So what kind of changes do you think, kind of a big question, but like what kind of changes do you think we could do on a small scale level within our homes, all the way up, kind of scaling up to like, just the way that the government or whatever, or like the whole system kind of works?
Yeah, Yeah, I have a couple of aspects at low level, and then we'll go higher level. But
Cool.
at low level, the first thing I would say to people is to be inquisitive about your own thoughts and your own perceptions. So if men are inquisitive about that, they're actually going to challenge it. They're going to be like, well, why do I believe that? Like, I just, why do I believe that? And then you're able to actually dive into where that probably stemmed from, whether it's an influence, whether it was a trauma, whatever that looked like, right? So when you're inquisitive, you already kickstart a different conversation internally of what it is to be a man, because you're questioning even the things that are going on in your mind, and you're creating a stronger foundation with the things that do make sense to you, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is, dude, we got to expand our emotional vocabulary. I talk about this all the time. There was a study done on this where there's something over 250 plus words associated with emotions. And they did a study on men and women, right? And they showed that men on average only had about 5 words of emotional vocabulary. That was it. And then on average, women weren't much better. They were like 8 to 9. So it's like when we look at this type of study being done on emotional vocabulary, it's kind of like an infant. Why does an infant cry all the time? Because an infant can't tell you I'm hungry. An infant can't tell you I just pooped in my diaper. An infant can't tell you that like I'm tired. They have to cry to get the attention and then see what response is given to them, right? That's what they're doing. Just like that, as adult men, we're basically like, I don't know how to show you anything else, so I'm going to look angry, right? That I've been told that's okay. I'm just going to look angry. But what I really feel is that I feel depressed, or I feel anxiety, which also isn't okay to feel as a man, or I feel sad, or I feel whatever it is that is expansive on that vocabulary, the nuances on your emotional vocabulary. So I think as a low level thing, men need to start getting well versed with emotional vocabulary. And that's not just to understand their emotions, it's to understand other people's emotions too. Because when we have a bigger vocabulary and understand where we're coming from, we actually start to create a higher level of emotional intelligence in our conversations with our friends, with our families, with our partners. Like all of that starts to expand. So you want to be a better man in this world, start to understand that part of you, because it's a massive part of us as human beings.
You know what though? This is why this is so tricky, is because I'm in Los Angeles and the school I teach at, it's like a private school now. The boys there have no problem talking about their emotions. They have a problem that when they stub their toe, they cry, even though they're 16 years old. So it's like, it's like, there's an element too that like you're probably getting maybe more because of your background, because of kind of like your look and all that kind of stuff, is like, you're getting guys that are like hard asses that don't reach that. But then me being like a school teacher, I'm like soft hearted, like, oh, how are you today, children? Lovely little snowflakes. Like then there's those kids that can't handle any kind of like heart, like that. Sure. They can express their emotions. So that balance is so tricky.
Well, that was going to be my third one. So my third one for low level stuff that we can do is to put ourselves in a physically challenging environment. And this is to gauge where we are with our own ability to persevere, with our own ability to experience some form of resistance and pain, right? To explore what that looks like. Because like you said, you put it perfectly. If we don't have that range to be able to balance, we're just on one end of the spectrum and we're unaware of what it really is to be a good man, because a good man understands both sides and can be like, okay, I understand where this guy's coming from. I understand where he's coming from. Let me bridge that gap. And I understand my own self to see both perspectives. So let me bridge that gap for where I'm at, and then create a response or create the environment that I feel is positive for everybody involved. Right. So, but we have to explore both sides. So do something, whether that's signing up for your first marathon, which that's tough, whether it's even signing up for a 10K and you're not a runner, like that's tough, whether it's signing up for something that puts you out in the woods for a few days to learn how to survive, that's tough in and of itself. You've never done it, whether it's like a Tough Mudder, those are great. Those are great for things like this to really challenge. They're tough. And then they also challenge you if you've never been in that aspect. Now, other guys that are like, oh yeah, that's super easy. Then you've already experienced this. You've already seen that side of the spectrum, right? So you know a little bit of level of what it takes to be a man that can survive and persevere and have that level of pain and experience it and say, no, I can push back. I'm not dead. Right. So like that is where we need to explore on a low level as well. That has to be part of the conversation.
That I love that. And you know what? And that's the spectrum. That is the cool thing that a lot of the men that I know I look up to, whether people I've met, people I haven't met, like whatever, is like they're soft, they're fun, they're playful, and they're badasses. Like they can kind of fit all of those different, check all of those boxes. They can do hard things, even like my nerdy friends, like the fact that they can like, build all kinds of cool stuff. My friends like, are architects and things like that. Like they're doing a lot of stuff. They're really good, Boy Scouts, and they can like, build a fire, whatever it is. Like having that full range is really kind of what the aim should be. So if you're more on this end, dive into this end a little bit. If you've just been behind a computer screen for the past 12 years or something, like, yeah, get out, go to the gym, challenge yourself, get into a jiu-jitsu class or something, like challenge yourself in that way. And if you've only been out there chopping wood, out in the woods, then maybe, get in touch with your feelings a little bit more and understand, the emotional side of the range. And I think that's really awesome.
Yeah, and I want to say one more thing about it.
Yeah.
And you mentioned jujitsu, and this is one of the things I love, because the fact that like guys are like, oh yeah, like maybe protection's not high on my list of being a man, right? Like it's not about that. If you get into any type of martial arts like jujitsu or Muay Thai or Aikido or anything like that, it's very challenging. Number one, you're going to be learning a new skill, but number two, you're going to know what it's like to face adversity, because you're going to fight against people who are better than you. And you're going to experience levels of kind of like fear and anxiety there, which is great. But guess what? You're going to learn a skill that makes you even just a more well-rounded man. Because first off, if you are somebody who's on the uber, what I like to call like that false alpha side, if you're on that, you're going to learn what it's like to be humbled, because you're never going to win every match. You're always going to have somebody who's better than you every time you walk in there. And not only that, but you're going to understand more methodically how to diffuse a situation, because you're not worried about if something goes to the level of physicality like a fight does, right? You're not concerned about it. So you're more likely to actually diffuse situations because you don't want to have to go to that level, right? So that's why, like, I love what Jordan Peterson says. Joe Rogan talks about this a lot as well. People should learn those things for all of those reasons, not just for protection. It's not about that. It's also about having that level of confidence to diffuse a situation, to not take it there because you know what you're capable of, and to give yourself a level of humbleness, because you're always going to have people who can beat you. I promise you, there's no BJJ gym or Muay Thai space you're going to go into that you're going to be the top dog, especially if you're just starting now. Like maybe if you've been doing it for 25 years, like cool. And even then you're going to have up and coming like stars, right? So like, it's just a place where you're constantly challenging that spectrum of perseverance, of pain threshold, of understanding your limitations, of understanding yourself and giving yourself a high level of confidence. So I love that you said that. I just want to mention that because I think that's very important.
Thank you, man. Yeah, I absolutely, and you're going to get choked out by a guy who's like 50 pounds less than you too.